She gave 3 decades to an alpha who called her loyalty duty. He chose someone younger. She walked into the mountains, and the moon chose her back. Before we begin, tap like so this story reaches someone who needs it, and subscribe for more healing, empowering werewolf romance stories. Now, take a slow breath with me. Let's go where the moonlight tells the truth. There is a particular kind of silence that settles over a woman who has given too much for too long. It is not the silence of peace. It is the silence of someone who has learned, slowly and without meaning to, that her voice was never truly expected to fill a room. Maren had known that silence for years. She stood at the edge of the great hall that evening, the way she always did, close enough to be useful, far enough not to presume. The Crescent River Pack's longhouse smelled of pine resin and roasting meat, of wood smoke and damp fur, and the particular musk of wolves gathered too close together in celebration. Lanterns hung in long amber rows from the raftered ceiling, their light catching on the silver at Maren's temples, on the laugh lines around her eyes, on hands that were strong and capable and had been, for 33 years, entirely devoted to this pack. 33 years. She had been 27 when she first arrived at Crescent River, a lone wolf by circumstance rather than by nature, her own small pack dissolved by illness and misfortune. Alpha Thorn had taken her in without ceremony, a practical man even then, and she had repaid that pragmatic kindness with everything she had. She learned the pack's traditions. She memorized the birth dates of every child born under the Crescent River moon. She sat beside dying elders and held their hands in the dark. She stood at Thorn's left flank during the border wars of the early years, her wolf quick and fierce and steady, absorbing injuries so others would not have to. She had been there when Thorn's first mate, Isadora, had grown sick. She had brewed the teas and changed the compresses and kept the household running while Thorn sat vigil, his grief so enormous it had seemed to swallow the whole of the mountain. And when Isadora finally passed, on a cold February morning with frost on the window panes, it was Maren who had gently taken the alpha's hand and led him away from the bed, who had spoken the words of release and renewal that the moon goddess required of the living. Afterward, people had watched them. Of course they had. Packs were communities, and communities noticed things. They noticed how Thorn sought Maren's counsel before any consequential decision. They noticed how she could calm him with a look when his temper rose during council meetings. They noticed the easy, unhurried comfort between them, the kind that only grows in the soil of shared years, shared losses, shared mornings at the same table with coffee going cold, and the business of the pack spread between them like a map of everything they had built. What people assumed from all this noticing, Maren had never quite let herself say aloud. Not that she had never felt it. She was a woman, after all, not a stone. There had been evenings when Thorn had looked at her across the fire and something moved behind his eyes, something that had made her heart lift like a bird startled from the grass. There had been a night, years ago now, when he had taken her hand during a difficult council vote and not let go until the vote was over, and his thumb had moved in small unconscious circles against her knuckles, and she had lain awake afterward remembering the warmth of it. But Thorn was a man of tradition, and tradition in werewolf packs was a force unto itself. And Alpha chose his Luna with the pack's stability in mind. He chose with his head. Maren understood this. She had told herself she understood this for so long that she had almost stopped being able to tell the difference between understanding and resignation. She had not, in all her years, allowed herself to become brittle. That was the one thing she held on to. Even now, standing at the edge of the celebration hall with a cup of warm cider she had barely touched, she kept her spine straight and her expression calm. She watched the pack move through the room, the young wolves roughhousing near the far tables, the elders clustered by the hearth, the children darting like quick fish between adult legs, and she felt the old familiar swell of love for all of it, for them, for this messy, complicated, imperfect family she had helped, in her quiet way, to hold together. She did not know, standing there, that the night was about to change everything. Thorn called for quiet just past the 8th hour, when the celebration was full-throated and the mead was flowing freely. He was a large man, still imposing at 64, with iron-gray hair and the kind of face that had been handsome once and had aged into something better, authoritative, weathered, earned. He stood at the head of the room and raised one hand, and the hall stilled, because it always did when Thorn asked it to. That was the gravity of an alpha. Even Maren, who knew him better than almost anyone, felt the pull of it. "I have an announcement," he said. His voice was the voice she knew in her bones, low and resonant, the kind that carried without effort. "One that I have been deliberating over for some time. An alpha without a Luna is a fire without a hearth. The goddess has reminded me of this, and I have listened." Maren's heart did something complicated in her chest. She made herself be still. "I have chosen," Thorn continued, "to take a Luna, to formally bond before the pack and the goddess, and to bring our future into balance." The hall murmured with approval. Maren watched faces across the room, warm, expectant, many of them turning, almost involuntarily, toward her. She saw it happen. She saw the small, knowing smiles. She saw two of the elder women exchange a glance. She saw young Petra, who had grown up with Maren braiding her hair on pack celebration days, press both hands over her mouth in anticipation. And she felt ashamed of how much she felt. The hope was enormous and sudden, and she had not known until that moment how long she had been carefully not feeling it. It rose in her throat as something swallowed too fast. "Lena," Thorn said, "would you come forward?" A young woman stepped out from the far side of the room. She was perhaps 30, perhaps a little older, dark-haired and bright-eyed, with the sleek, sure movement of a wolf in her prime. She was lovely in the uncomplicated way of the young, luminous with potential, untouched by loss in any serious way. She moved toward Thorn with her chin raised and her smile wide, and she was, Maren thought, with a clarity that was almost surgical, entirely appropriate, by pack tradition, by optics, by every measure that Thorn, as a man of his generation, would have used. The hall erupted. Maren did not move. She held her cider cup in both hands, and she breathed, slowly through her nose, the way she had learned to breathe during the border wars, when everything was very loud and very dangerous and moving too fast. She watched Thorn take Lena's hand. She watched the pack rush forward with congratulations. She watched the moment close around the two of them like water closing over a stone, and she understood, with a certainty that settled into her bones like cold, that she had been wrong. Not wrong to care, not wrong to hope, but wrong to wait. Wrong to make herself useful in the place where she had wanted to be loved. She would have left then, quietly, in the manner she had always employed, without fuss, without drama, handling her grief in private the way she handled everything in private. But Thorn saw her moving toward the door. He crossed the room with an alpha's swift certainty and caught her just inside the threshold, out of the worst of the noise. "Maren." His voice was careful in a way that made her chest ache, the voice a man uses when he is about to say something he has rehearsed. "Congratulations," she said. She meant to sound warm. She thought she did, mostly. "I want you to understand," he said, "what you have given this pack, what you have given me, I don't take it lightly. Your service—" The word landed like a stone in still water. Service. She looked at him. He was watching her with something in his face that might have been regret or might have been relief. She could not, in that moment, tell the difference, and the fact that she could not should have told him something important about how clearly she had been seeing him all these years. "Your loyalty," he amended. "It has been a tremendous—" "I understand," she said. And she did. That was the most devastating part. She understood perfectly. "I wish you both well, Thorn, truly." She walked out into the cold night air before either of them could say anything else. Above her, the moon was full and indifferent and enormous, flooding the mountain meadow with silver light. She stood in it for a long moment with her eyes closed and her breath making small clouds in the darkness, and she let herself feel it, the full, awful, clarifying weight of what had just happened. He had called it loyalty. Not love, not partnership, not the word she had been quietly, carefully, foolishly hoping for. Loyalty. As though she were a very faithful hound. She did not make a scene. That was not her way, and it would not become her way simply because her heart had been broken, because she recognized it for what it was now, cracked open and raw there in her chest. She walked back to her cottage at the edge of the Pax settlement, the one she had tended and made comfortable over 3 decades, and she sat at her kitchen table in the dark for a long while. She did not cry, not yet. Crying came later, in the small hours, when she had given herself permission. First, she thought. She thought about the woman she had been at 27, arriving at Crescent River with everything she owned in a canvas pack. She thought about the woman she had become, strong, yes, capable, certainly, respected in the abstract way that utility is respected. But when had she last done something purely for herself? When had she last made a choice based entirely on what Maren wanted, not what the pack needed, not what Thorn's household required, not what a good and loyal member of the community would do? She sat with that question for a long time. By morning, she had her answer. She packed with the methodical care of a woman who has always been organized under pressure. She took her clothes, her books, her grandmother's quilt, and her collection of dried herbs. She took the mortar and pestle that had belonged to her mother, and the small clay wolf figurine she had carved herself the winter after Isadora died, during the long evenings when she had needed something to do with her hands. She took the journal she had been keeping, intermittently, for 20 years. She left behind everything that belonged to the pack, the ceremonial items Thorn had entrusted to her keeping, the household records she had maintained, the emergency stores she had organized. She left a careful, thorough note detailing where everything was and what everything was for, because she was not a woman who left messes behind her, even now. She was gone before the rest of the settlement woke. She shifted into her wolf form at the tree line. Her wolf was large and tawny, with a white blaze across the chest that had always made her look, she thought, slightly formal. And she ran. She ran hard and fast through the forest, through the bracken and the cold morning air, through the familiar territory and then beyond it, past the pack's border stones, out into the wild mountain country that had no claim on her and on which she had placed no claim. She ran until her legs ached and her lungs burned and her mind went quiet. And then she stopped, somewhere high in the mountains where the pines grew sparse and the sky opened up vast and pale with early light, and she lifted her muzzle and she howled. Not in sorrow, not in grief exactly, though grief was in it, in release. The sound echoed back to her from the mountain faces, multiplied and returned, and she stood in the cold dawn and heard herself, truly heard herself, without the pack's needs mediating the sound, for the first time in decades. She had forgotten what she sounded like. She found the cabin the way she found most things, by following her instincts and trusting them. It sat in a clearing at the edge of a narrow valley, half a day's run from Crescent River territory, close enough that she could return quickly if there were a true emergency, far enough that the psychic weight of the pack's bond hummed at the very edge of her senses rather than resonating at full volume. It was old, the cabin, older than she was, built from hand-cut timber that had silvered to the color of driftwood over the years. The roof was sound, the chimney drew cleanly, the windows were grimy but intact. There was a root cellar beneath the floor and a spring-fed creek 20 yards from the front door and a small herb garden gone to seed and weed that called to something in her hands the moment she saw it. She stood in the clearing for a long time, taking it in. Her wolf was alert and curious beside her in her mind. Not anxious, she noticed. Not the tight, watchful vigilance that had been her wolf's constant companion in the pack, always monitoring, always ready, just interested, present. "Yes," Maren said aloud, to the clearing and to her wolf and to no one in particular. "This will do." The first weeks were about practical things. She repaired the cabin's weakest points with the tools she found in the outbuilding. She cleaned 30 years of someone else's dust from the corners. She laid in stores from the forest, mushrooms, acorns, the last of the autumn berries, and fished the creek in the mornings when the light was low and the water was silver and still. She slept when she was tired, and woke when she was rested, and ate when she was hungry, and the radical simplicity of this, of listening to her body's actual requirements rather than the pack's schedule, was so strange at first that it almost frightened her. Almost. Because underneath the strangeness was something else. Something that came to her in the early mornings when she sat on the cabin's front step with her hands wrapped around a clay mug of black tea and watched the mist move through the valley below like slow breathing. A feeling she had to search her memory for, it had been so long. Peace. Actual, uncomplicated peace. Not the peace of exhaustion, not the peace of having managed a crisis successfully, not the peace of a moment's rest before the next thing needing doing. The peace of a woman who had, for the first time in memory, nowhere to be but exactly where she was. She had forgotten that she liked to cook. Not the practical, efficient cooking she had done for decades at Crescent River. Great pots of stew for pack gatherings, meals timed to pack schedules, cooking as logistics. She meant the other kind, the kind her grandmother had taught her, slow and attentive, as a form of conversation with the ingredients. Her grandmother had said that a good cook paid attention the way a healer paid attention, with all the senses engaged and no part of the mind somewhere else. Maren had not cooked that way since she was a girl. Now she had time. Now she had nothing but time and forest and the creek's quiet company. She gathered what grew wild in the valley, winter herbs like rosemary and thyme and the sharp little leaves of wood sorrel, tubers and roots and the dried seed heads of plants she had not tended in years. She made soups that took all afternoon. She made bread in the cabin's little cast-iron oven and stood close to watch it rise, remembering the smell from her childhood kitchen with a vividness that surprised her. Memory did that when the noise was finally quiet enough. It floated up. She remembered her mother at the stove, her grandmother in the garden, pinching dead blooms and talking to the plants in the low, sensible way of women who understand that everything living responds to being spoken to. She remembered herself as a young girl, before the losses, before the lone wolf years, before Crescent River. A girl who had laughed easily and been curious about everything, and who had climbed trees just to see what she could see from higher up. That girl. She had been there this whole time. Maren sat with that recognition one afternoon, while the bread was in the oven and the snow was coming down soft and thick outside, and she felt something release in her chest, something that had been clenched there so long she had stopped being aware of the tension, like a fist uncurling, like a breath finally fully let go. She picked up her journal and she wrote for 2 hours without stopping. She wrote about Crescent River, about Thorn, about the specific, complicated grief of realizing that what she had mourned was not just the relationship she had hoped for, but the version of herself she had never gotten to be. The Maren who had put her own needs away so thoroughly that she had stopped being able to find them. She wrote about her mother and her grandmother. She wrote about her wolf, who was growing stronger and stranger in the mountain quiet, as though the distance from the pack was letting her wolf breathe more fully than she had in years. Then she closed the journal and she went outside in the snow, and she tipped her face up to the gray winter sky, and she laughed. Not at anything in particular, just by herself, at the absurdity and beauty of being 61 years old and standing in the snow outside a cabin no one had lived in for decades, laughing because the bread smelled good and the mountain was quiet, and she was, for the first time in longer than she could accurately remember, entirely herself. The laugh came up from somewhere old and genuine, and it echoed off the mountain faces, and her wolf stirred warmly in her chest in answer. Winter gave way to spring the way it always did in the high mountains, grudgingly and then all at once. One morning there was still a hard crust of ice on the creek, and a week later the valley was full of meltwater and bird song and the first tentative green of new growth pushing up through the wet soil. Maren went to work on the herb garden. She had always known plants. It was one of the things she had brought to Crescent River, her knowledge of healing herbs, of roots and barks and flowers, of the old ways that the pack's younger members were losing touch with. She had maintained the pack's medicinal stores, had been the first one called when someone was ill or injured, had sat with sick children through long nights with compresses and teas, and the steady, reassuring presence that she had never had to learn because it had always simply been hers. But this garden was hers alone. She cleared the weeds by hand, feeling the cold earth between her fingers, finding something centering in the physical simplicity of the work. She planted in careful rows, lavender for calm, chamomile for sleep, yarrow for healing, valerian for the deep aches that had settled into her joints over the winter. She planted comfrey and calendula, and the sweet wild bergamot that her grandmother had called the beekeeper because of how it drew them. She talked to the plants, not apologetically, not in the way of a person worried about being overheard, openly, matter-of-factly, in the way her grandmother had. She told them what she was asking of them. She told them about the months since she had left the pack, the grief and the quiet and the slow, effortful business of rediscovering who she was without the role she had played for so long. She thought sometimes that the plants leaned toward her when she spoke. She knew that was probably fanciful. She did not particularly care. Her wolf, meanwhile, was changing. She had always been a good wolf, strong, experienced, reliable in a crisis. But she had also been for decades a wolf in service, a wolf who used her abilities in specific, directed ways within the framework of the pack's structure, always working within boundaries, always aware of the alpha's position above her. Out here, with no hierarchy to orient herself around, her wolf was relearning something older. The mountains were teaching her things she had never needed to know inside a pack: how to read wind, how to navigate by stars alone, how to move through her own territory with a confidence that came not from the pack's collective strength, but from her own. She was more powerful than she had known. This dawned on her slowly over the spring months, in the way she could sense approaching weather a full day ahead now, not the 6 or 8 hours that had been her pack norm. In the way the forest creatures, the deer, the foxes, even the bears passing through in their slow, enormous way, regarded her with a quality of attention she had not received before, something watchful and respectful, as though they recognized something in her she had not yet fully recognized in herself. She mentioned it to no one, because there was no one to mention it to. She simply noted it, the way she noted everything now. with careful attention and without rushing to explain it. It was a night in late spring, warm enough finally to leave the cabin door open, the valley full of fireflies and the creaking of frogs and the wide, generous dark that comes to high places far from human light. Maren had been sitting on the front step in the manner she had adopted over the months, a cup of chamomile tea, the journal open on her knee, the stars overhead doing what stars have always done, which is to make everything feel both more significant and less urgent. Her wolf was drowsy and content in her chest. The herb garden smelled of fresh growth and damp earth and something sweeter she could not name. She was not asleep, but she was not quite fully wake either. That liminal state that healers and night watchers know, the place between alertness and rest where the mind opens up in ways it cannot manage in the daylight busyness. The light came gradually. Not suddenly, not in any dramatic manner of vision or revelation. It gathered at the edge of the clearing the way moonlight gathers sometimes in open places, pooling, deepening, gaining a warmth that ordinary moonlight does not have. Maren noticed it first as a change in the quality of the air, a softening, a faint fragrance like something she had not smelled since childhood, her grandmother's kitchen and wildflowers and the clean, particular scent of the air just before rain. She lowered her teacup. The light moved into the clearing slowly, without hurry, in a way that communicated enormous patience, the patience of something that has all the time there is. It did not take a shape exactly, but it felt like a presence that was female and ancient and deeply, profoundly warm. The kind of warmth that Maren associated with her grandmother's arms around her as a small girl, with the specific safe feeling of being held by someone who loved you entirely and without condition. Her wolf was absolutely still, not the stillness of fear, the stillness of reverence. "Maren," said the light. It did not use sound exactly, or rather the sound was not in the air but inside her, as though her own heartbeat had formed itself into a word. "My daughter, I have been waiting for you to be still enough to hear me." Maren did not question it. A healer's life is a life lived close to the edges of ordinary reality, and she had learned long ago to trust what her deeper senses told her. She breathed slowly, and she said, "I'm listening." "I know how long you have been carrying," the goddess said. "I have watched you. I have watched you carry others' weight so naturally that you stopped knowing there was any other way to be. I have watched you make yourself smaller and smaller until you almost disappeared into the useful shape of yourself." Something moved through Maren at those words, a wave of recognition so complete it was almost physical. Her throat tightened. "The heartbreak you experienced," the goddess continued, gentle as a hand on the back of the neck, "was not punishment. It was not your failure. It was mine, the nudge I send to my daughters when they have wandered so far from their own truth that they need a door closed before they can find the right one." "I had hoped," Maren began, and stopped. "I know what you hoped. You hoped for love, and that hope was not wrong, but you had placed that hope in the wrong direction, facing outward. The love I am bringing you is different. It begins inside you. It always has." The light seemed to deepen, to gather itself. "You were never meant to stand behind an alpha, Maren. You were never meant to be the steady, invisible support behind a man's power. The power is yours. It has always been yours. You have been lending it away." Maren felt her wolf surge, not in aggression, but in recognition, a deep, full-body recognition, like a chord struck and finally resolved after years of incomplete music. Her wolf had always known. Her wolf had been waiting. "A Luna Alpha," the goddess said, That is what you are, what you have always been, the rarest thing, a woman whose power comes from within herself, not from bonding to another's strength. The mountains have been teaching you. Your garden has been teaching you. The quiet has been teaching you. You have been learning, my daughter, to come home to yourself. I don't know how to be that, Maren said honestly. I have only ever known how to serve. Service given freely by a full woman is a gift, the goddess said. Service given because you do not believe you are entitled to your own life, that is something else. You know the difference now. You are beginning to know it. The warmth gathered closer, and Maren felt it move through her, not just over her skin, but through her, through the wolf and the woman together, illuminating something that had been in shadow for so long she had confused the shadow for her true shape. She felt the power in it, old and enormous and entirely, undeniably hers. There will be a time to return, the goddess said, already beginning to recede, the warmth easing back like a tide. You will know when, and when you return, you will not go back, you will go forward, as who you truly are. Will I be ready? Maren asked. She heard the smallness in the question and did not try to take it back. The warmth paused, and if a light can be said to smile, this one did. My love, said the moon goddess, you have been ready for 30 years. You only needed to believe it. Then the light was ordinary again, just moonlight, just the familiar pale silver of a late spring night, and Maren sat alone on her front step with her cold tea and her open journal and her wolf burning bright as a new star in her chest. She sat there until dawn. Then she rose, went inside, and she began. It began with her wolf. She had been shifting regularly for months. The mountain air made her want to run. The wolf in her needed the freedom. But now she shifted differently. Now she paid attention in a new way. Not just to the physical experience of the shift, not just to the sensory richness of the wolf's world with its deep register of scent and sound, and the particular electricity of the mountain wind. She paid attention to the power. It was unlike anything she had touched before. It felt like standing in a river, not being swept away by it, but feeling the full weight and direction of a current that ran through her rather than past her. It felt like the earth itself recognizing her. When she moved through the forest in her wolf form, she felt the territory respond, the trees, the soil, the bedrock itself carrying some awareness of her passage. The deer did not run, the birds did not fall silent. She moved through it all like a hand through water, and everything settled around her the way things settle around a natural center. She was an alpha, not because she had declared it, not because anyone had awarded it to her or conferred it in a ceremony, because the goddess had revealed what had always been true. She was and had always been made of alpha stuff. The deep, inherent, unearned kind, the kind that cannot be given or taken, only acknowledged. Learning to inhabit it fully was its own practice. She ran every morning, not the exhausted, grief-driven running of her first weeks, but intentional, focused movement, learning the edges and depths of her power, the way a musician learns an instrument, with patience and repetition, and a willingness to be awkward before becoming fluent. She practiced the thing she had seen Thorn do unconsciously, the particular quality of attention that settles the people around you, the way a true alpha's presence can slow a panicked heart or lift a frightened child without a word. She practiced it on herself first. On the mornings when grief rose up, because grief does not resolve simply because you have been visited by a goddess and told wonderful things about yourself, grief has its own schedule and its own curriculum. She practiced meeting it with the steadiness she had always offered others. She sat with the ache of the lost years. She sat with the specific sorrow of having been seen, for 3 decades, only as useful. She let it move through her without either drowning in it or running from it, and she found, gradually, that sitting with her own pain gave her a different quality of understanding than she had ever had before. She had always been compassionate. Now she was becoming wise. There is a difference, and it matters. Compassion is a gift of nature. Some people simply carry more of it than others, and Maren had always carried an abundance. But wisdom is built. It requires the particular material of lived pain, processed rather than suppressed. It requires the work of reflection, of honestly accounting for one's own choices rather than only for the choices of others. It requires, above all, time. She had time. She used it. She found him, or he found her, or perhaps the mountain arranged it, which was not so outlandish a thought as it once might have been, on a morning in midsummer when the valley was drowning in wildflower and the creek was running high with snowmelt. She had been gathering yarrow, her basket over one arm, moving through the tall grass at the meadow's edge with the unhurried attention of a woman who knows exactly what she is looking for. The wolf in her registered him before her eyes did, a scent carried on the uphill breeze, unfamiliar but not alarming. Male, older wolf, lone or close to it. The quality of calm that characterized him was unusual. Most lone wolves carried a particular restless edge, the unease of a social animal outside its social structure. This one did not. She stood up from her crouch and looked across the meadow. He stood at the far tree line, not quite in the shadow of the pines, watching her. He was a large man, broad through the shoulder, the kind of build that comes from actual physical work rather than effort, and that carries into old age as solidity rather than bulk. His hair was entirely silver, cut close, and his face was the face of someone who had been through serious things and come out the other side without bitterness, lined, quiet, self-possessed. He wore simple clothes, a worn flannel shirt, good boots, and he held his hands easy at his sides, which Maren noted. Tense hands were a thing she watched for automatically, old healer's habit. His hands were relaxed. She did not feel threatened. Her wolf did not feel threatened. What she felt was something more interesting and more complicated than threat, something she had not expected to feel at all, standing in a mountain meadow in her 62nd year, with yarrow in her basket and soil under her fingernails. Interested. "You're well back from the border stones," she said. The Crescent River borders were miles from here, but as a Crescent Alpha she had begun to feel the edges of something larger, not any specific pack's claimed territory, but the wider mountain country she had been slowly, quietly making her own. "I know," he said. His voice was unhurried. "I apologize for coming without notice. I've been moving through the range and I smelled your campfire. I meant to pass well clear of your claim, but I wanted—" He paused, and the pause was thoughtful rather than evasive. "I wanted you to know I was here. It seemed rude not to introduce myself." Maren looked at him for a moment. "That is an unusually considerate thing for a lone wolf to say," she said. Something crossed his face, not quite a smile, but the ancestor of one. Rowan, formerly of the Ironwood pack before it dissolved, currently, he glanced around at the mountain, currently between situations. "Maren," she said, "currently between situations myself, I suppose." That did make him smile, quiet and brief, and reaching his eyes in a way she found, against all reasonable expectation, entirely lovely. She gestured toward the cabin. "The bread is about done. If you're passing through, you're welcome to eat before you go." He looked at her with the steady directness of someone who does not feel the need to perform social ease, not cold, simply genuine. "I would appreciate that very much," he said. "Thank you." They walked back to the cabin side by side through the tall summer grass, and Maren felt her wolf regarding this with a calm, deep interest that she had not known her wolf was capable of anymore. He did not leave that day. Not because he was forward. He was, she learned, almost remarkable in his undemanding quality, the rare capacity of a person who can be fully present without requiring anything in particular from you. He ate the bread, and he told her, when she asked, about the ironwood pack and its dissolution after their alpha died without a named successor, about the 2 years he had spent since then moving through the mountain range, not running exactly, but not arriving anywhere either. "What did you do for the ironwood pack?" she asked. "Warrior, tracker, council elder, eventually." He looked at his hands, those large, easy, unhurried hands. "I was good at conflict, less good at knowing what to do when there wasn't any." She understood that, the specific disorientation of a person defined by their usefulness in a crisis, suddenly without crisis. She said so, and he looked at her with an attention she was not accustomed to, not searching or assessing, but simply genuinely interested. "You've been figuring that out," he said, not a question. "I have," she agreed. "It's slower than a crisis, and somehow harder." "Yes," he said, with the particular conviction of someone who has learned a thing the same long way. He stayed because there was no particular reason to leave, and because the mountain was easy in high summer, and because, she suspected, though neither of them said it directly, they were both in the peculiar position of people who had been very busy for a very long time and were still adjusting to being not busy at all. They were useful to each other in the uncomplicated way of people who are similar enough to understand and different enough to be interesting. He was a good woodcutter. He had a gift for finding and identifying animal tracks that complemented her gift for plants. He could reconstruct the story of a forest clearing from its disturbances, the way she could reconstruct a person's health from their smell and color. He was, she found, also a surprisingly good listener. Not a talker, not a man who filled silences in order to demonstrate his comfort with them, but someone who had learned that silence is not absence and could sit across from her in the long summer evenings without either of them needing to fill every moment with words. She found this extraordinary. She had spent her adult life around people who needed something from her attention, her care, her expertise, her reassurance. Rowan did not need anything from her, and the freedom of that was so unfamiliar that it took her weeks to relax fully into it. He saw her power. That was the other thing. He saw it simply and without drama, in the practical way of someone who has worked alongside strength long enough to recognize it without being either threatened by it or unnecessarily reverential. He watched her move through the territory. He watched the way the forest regarded her. He asked careful, intelligent questions about the power she was still learning to understand. And once, just once, he said with the directness that seemed to be his natural mode, "You are a significant thing, Maren. Whatever happened to make you not know that, it was wrong, and you should know it was always visible, from the outside. Whatever you were in, they were fortunate, and they should have said so." She looked at him for a long moment. "Thank you," she said. The simplest words and the most complete ones. He nodded and went back to carving the bowl he had been working on, and that was that. She went back to her journal and wrote for a very long time. The runner came on a hot afternoon in late summer, moving fast and with the particular tight-legged gait of a wolf carrying bad news. Maren saw her coming from half a mile out. She could feel the distress long before she could see the runner clearly, and she was standing at the edge of the clearing when the young woman broke through the tree line and stopped, chest heaving, eyes wide. It was Petra. Maren felt something shift in her chest at the sight of the girl, young woman now, but Maren still saw the child she had braided ribbons into the hair of during festival days. Petra's face was dirty, and her eyes were red-rimmed, and she had clearly been running for hours. "Maren," Petra's voice broke on the word. "Please, you have to come. We have nowhere else to turn." Maren crossed the clearing and took the girl's hands, steadying her, the old healer's calm arriving without effort. "Breathe. Tell me." The story came out in broken pieces, each piece worse than the last. A rogue pack had been encroaching on Crescent River territory for months, organized, aggressive, led by an alpha with a particular talent for psychological pressure, for eroding morale and manufacture of confusion before open conflict. They had taken 3 of the outlying farms. 2 of the pack's younger warriors had been wounded in skirmishes. Thorn had negotiated, had threatened, had sent challenges that went unacknowledged. And now the rogue pack had issued an ultimatum: territorial surrender or open war, war that Crescent River, weakened and divided, could not survive. "Alpha Thorn sent me," Petra said. Her voice was careful with it, careful with whatever she knew or suspected about what had passed between Thorn and Maren. He asks," she pressed her lips together. "He says he knows he has no right to ask, that he would understand if you refused, but he asks anyway, because we don't know who else could help us." Maren was quiet for a moment. She had thought about this possibility. In her honest moments, alone on the mountain with the moon goddess's words still resonating in her like a bell, she had thought about the fact that the pack would likely need her eventually. She had thought about whether she would go. She had thought about bitterness, about the satisfaction of saying no, about the seductive simplicity of a door closed and not reopened. But she had also thought about the children, about the elders, about Petra with her hair full of ribbons, about the pack that was flawed and imperfect and had taken her for granted and was also, undeniably, people she loved. Power does not mean the freedom to withhold yourself from those who need you. It means the freedom to choose how and when and on whose terms you give. She turned to find Rowan standing in the cabin doorway, his arms crossed loosely, watching her with his steady, unhurried attention. "You're going," he said. Again, not a question. "I'm going," I said. He nodded. "Then I'll come with you, if you'll have a second pair of hands." She looked at him for a moment, at the calm, solid, unhurried offer of it, not an assumption, not a statement of what he intended to do regardless of her wishes. A question, clearly framed, waiting for her answer. "Yes," she said, "I would welcome that very much." She came back to Crescent River on a warm evening, from the eastern approach, with Rowan at her left flank and Petra half a step behind. She came in her human form, which was a choice she had thought about carefully. It would have been simpler, perhaps more visually dramatic, to arrive in her wolf form, all that tawny power and the white-blazed chest. But she was not coming for drama, she was coming to help. She came as the woman she was, in practical clothes with her hair loose and her hands free, and she came with the particular quality of stillness that she had spent all these months learning to carry. The pack felt her coming before they saw her. She felt them feel her, the ripple of awareness that moved through the pack bond as she crossed the border stones, not the usual return of a pack member, but something different. Something that made wolves lift their heads and turn toward her without quite knowing why. She felt the power move ahead of her like a wave, gentle but undeniable, and she felt the pack respond to it with a collective loosening of the tension that had been wound through them for months. They were afraid. She felt their fear like a texture in the air, complex and honest, the fear of people who had been living under pressure for too long. She did not try to dismiss or minimize it. She let her presence speak to it quietly, steadily. "I am here. This is manageable. You are not alone in this." Thorn was waiting for her at the entrance to the longhouse. He looked older than a year should have made him look. The burden of a threatened pack is a specific kind of weight, and it sat on him visibly, in the lines deeper around his mouth, in the new gray at his temples, in the way he held his shoulders as though bracing against something. He looked at her and she could see what the year had done to his certainty, not erased it. He was still an alpha, still a man of considerable will, but complicated it, introduced doubt where there had been only conviction. He had changed. She was not sure it was enough, and she did not need it to be. She was not here for him. "Maren," he said. His voice was different than it had been, stripped of the alpha authority he sometimes used as armor, just his voice, tired and uncertain and honest. "Maren," she said, steady, warm enough to be civil, clear enough to establish that nothing was assumed. He stopped. Around them, pack members had gathered in the loose, uncertain way of a crowd that wants to witness something but is not sure what it is witnessing. Thorn looked around at them and then back at her, and something in his face did the thing that must have cost him considerably. It opened. "I was wrong," he said, not quietly. He said it with the full weight of his alpha voice, the voice that carried. He said it so the pack could hear. "I took what you gave and called it what was comfortable. I called it duty and loyalty and service, because those words were easier for me than the truth. The truth was that you deserved more. You have always deserved more. And I am sorry, not to repair what I said, which cannot be repaired, but because you deserve to hear that I was wrong." The clearing was very quiet. Maren looked at him for a long moment, this man she had known so well and understood in some ways so imperfectly, this flawed and complicated alpha with his good intentions and his blind spots, and she found to her own slight surprise that what she felt was not anger and not grief and not the desire to have an accounting, a fair settlement of all the years. What she felt was simply done. Done in the clean way, the released way, the way of a woman who has done her own work and arrived on the other side of it and found that the past, while real and indelible, does not have to be a weight carried forward. "I hear you," she said. "Thank you for saying it." And then, because she was not coming back to relitigate old grievances, but to address a present crisis, "Now, tell me about these rogues. Tell me everything." What happened over the following 3 days was, in later years, something the Crescent River Pack would tell their children and their children's children, in the way that packs preserve the stories that matter. Maren sat with the council for a full day, not at Thorn's left hand this time, not in her old position of useful but peripheral, but at the table's head, where she had been ushered without ceremony by Thorn himself, without hesitation. She listened to everyone. She asked clear, penetrating questions. She held the space with a quality of authority that did not need to announce itself. The elders felt it. The warriors felt it. Even the youngest council members who had never met her before felt it and oriented toward her the way plants orient toward light. She saw the problem clearly. The rogue pack's strategy was not primarily military, it was psychological. They had been eroding the Crescent River Pack's confidence for months, making the territory feel unsafe, making decision-making feel impossible, manufacturing a sense of siege that had begun to make the pack turn on itself in small, abrading ways. Thorn's strength was in direct conflict. He had struggled because there was no single clear enemy to confront. This was not that kind of problem. "The pack needs to remember what it is," she said to the council. "Before we address the external threat, we address the internal one. Fear that has been fed for months does not leave because the source of the fear is removed. It has to be spoken to directly." She spoke to the full pack the next morning. She stood in the longhouse, and she did not use the formal ceremonial position, the raised dais, the alpha's chair. She stood among them at the room's center, and she waited for the fidgeting and whispering to settle. And when it settled, she said simply and with a directness that cut through every layer of assumption and defensiveness, "Tell me what you're afraid of. Not the rogues. What are you afraid of in here?" The silence that followed was the silence before something breaks open. And then they told her. One voice, and then another, and then the room full of them. The fears they had not been able to say to their alpha because you do not show weakness to your alpha. The fears they had not said to each other because everyone was already frightened and you do not add to a frightened person's burden. The fears they had barely said to themselves. She received it all. She held it without flinching and without minimizing and without offering false comfort, and she gave back to each fear the honest, grounded response it deserved. By the time the morning was over, the pack had changed. Not dramatically, not in a way that could be measured in a single morning, but the particular psychic weight of unexpressed fear had shifted, and with it the quality of how the pack held itself, more upright, more cohesive, more itself. The rogue alpha came to the border on the third day. He came with 8 of his wolves in the full weight of his considerable personal intimidation, and he came expecting to find a pack on the edge of fracture. He found Maren. She stood at the border stones with Rowan at her left, calm, watchful, ready in the quiet way of an experienced warrior, and with the Crescent River pack arrayed behind her, and what she projected was not aggression and not fear and not the desperate defiance of people protecting something they believed they might lose. She projected what she had learned in the mountain silence, the absolute grounded certainty of a woman who knows what she is. The rogue alpha was not a foolish man. He looked at her across the border stones and he understood, with the instinct of an alpha facing another alpha, what he was dealing with. Not the worn, anxious pack he had been slowly disassembling over months. Something different. Something that had reconsolidated around a power he had not anticipated and could not match. Not with 8 wolves, not with his particular talent for psychological pressure, not with his ultimatum. Power recognizes power. She did not threaten him, she did not perform dominance, she simply stood in who she was, and she said in the voice she had spent a year learning to use, "This territory is not available. The Crescent River pack is not available. You will leave, now, and you will not return." A pause, clean and unhurried. The moon goddess sees these lands, and she sees what is done on them. The rogue alpha looked at her for a long moment. Then he turned and led his wolves back into the forest, and the trees closed behind them, and that was that. That evening, the pack celebrated. Not the forced celebration of people trying to feel better than they did, but the genuine release of a community that has come through something difficult and arrived on the other side of it whole. Maren sat at the center of it, not the edge this time, and let herself be there. Let herself receive the gratitude and the warmth and the numerous embraces from people who were not thanking her for her usefulness, but for herself, for her presence, for the specific, irreplaceable quality of who she was. The elder women found her early in the evening, 3 of them, Bess and Margaret and old Evelyn, who had been Maren's closest thing to confidants in the old life, and they sat around her like the points of a compass, and they looked at her with the clear, undeceived eyes of women who had seen a great deal. "You've changed," Bess said, not like a question. "I have," Maren agreed. "Good," said Evelyn, with the brisk satisfaction of a woman whose opinion on the matter had been settled for some time. "We always said you were doing too much disappearing." Maren laughed. The laugh came from the same place it had come from in the snow outside the mountain cabin, deep and real and entirely her own. Thorn came to her later, when the celebration had mellowed into its slower hours and the fire was lower and the children were mostly asleep. He came without ceremony and sat beside her, and for a while they were simply 2 people who had known each other for a very long time, sitting in the quiet of a thing resolved. "Lena and I," he began. "You don't need to tell me," she said gently. "No, but I want you to know it was a mistake. Not her. She's a fine woman, and she'll make a fine Luna for whoever is right for her. But my reasoning was wrong. I was following tradition when I should have been following—" He stopped. "Your heart," she offered. "Something like that." He looked at his hands, then at her. "Could there be a possibility?" "No," she said, warm, clear, without apology and without cruelty. He nodded slowly, the nod of a man accepting a verdict he had expected. "Is it because of him?" A small motion of his head toward where Rowan was standing at the edge of the firelight, talking with two of the pack's senior warriors with the easy authority of a man who has spent a long life in the company of capable people. Maren considered the question with the honesty it deserved. "No," she said finally. "It's because of me, because I know now what I was looking for in you all those years, and it wasn't you exactly, it was permission. Permission to matter, permission to be fully myself in this place I had given so much to." She looked at him steadily. "I don't need permission anymore." Thorne was quiet for a long time. "I'm glad," he said finally, and she thought he meant it in the complicated way of a good man reckoning honestly with the good he had failed to do. "So am I," she said. She found Rowan later, when the fire had burned lower and most of the pack had drifted toward sleep. He was standing outside the longhouse in the cool night air, looking up at the stars with the comfortable self-containment she had come to associate with him, a man who is genuinely at ease in his own company and does not need to be attended to. She stood beside him. They were quiet for a while, in the way they had learned to be quiet, the comfortable silence of two people who did not need to fill space to feel connected. "What do you want?" he asked, simply, as though it were the most natural question, which with him it always somehow was. She thought about it properly, not the reflexive, "I'm fine" response, not the deflection she had spent decades perfecting. What did she want? Right now, in this night, with her power settled into her bones, and the pack's gratitude warm around her, and this man beside her who saw her with such clear and uncomplicated regard. "I want to go back to the mountain, to the cabin, to the garden, and the mornings and the creek." She paused. "I want to keep building what I started up there." Another pause, longer. "I wouldn't object to company." He turned to look at her. In the starlight, his eyes were very quiet and very warm. "I've been between situations for 2 years," he said. "I think I've been looking for somewhere to be without quite knowing what it should look like." A pause of his own. "I think it might look like this, if you'll have me. I don't mean—" He made a small, careful gesture. "I mean, I'd like to be in your story. In whatever way makes sense, slowly, at whatever pace is right." She looked at him, this quiet, silver-haired, unhurried man who had never once in their acquaintance tried to diminish or redirect or explain her, who had simply seen her and continued seeing her without apparent effort, as though she were entirely visible and always had been. "Yes," she said, slowly. "That sounds exactly right." He smiled, fully this time, warmly, in the unreserved way of a man who does not need to protect himself from his own happiness. They stood together in the starlight for a long time. The Crescent River pack asked her to stay. They asked in the formal way, with the council assembled and the proper word spoken. An invitation to a Luna Alpha was no small thing, and they did not extend it casually. They offered her the position that should, perhaps, have been offered years ago, not as a support to another's authority, but as a leader in her own right, a Luna Alpha for a pack that had not fully understood until now what they had been given. She thanked them, and she declined. Not out of bitterness. She examined herself carefully for that, because bitterness is a thing that hides itself from the person carrying it, and she wanted to be honest. No. It was not bitterness. It was simply the clear-eyed knowledge that Crescent River was not hers to lead. It was Thorne's and Lena's in time, who would be good at it when she had grown into the role. The pack that was hers to lead, if she led one at all, would need to be built from the beginning, differently, on the foundation she had been learning to lay. She did agree to be an advisor, to come when she was truly needed, as herself, on her terms, with her own life intact elsewhere. The pack agreed without hesitation, with the fervent relief of people who had just learned what they had almost lost permanently. She and Rowan left on a clear morning, early, before the heat of the day. She said her goodbyes, long ones, with the elder women, and with Petra, who wept and held on and whispered, fiercely, that she would visit, and that she was going to be different too, that watching Maren had made her want to be different. "You already are," Maren told her. "You carried the message. That took courage. Remember that." Petra lifted her chin. She would remember. Thorn walked her to the border stones, as he had not done when she left the first time. He stood at the edge of his territory and looked at her with the complicated honesty that had, she thought, been waiting in him for a long time to be allowed out. "Be well," he said. "You too," she said. And she meant it, simply and without any residue of the old hope. She wished him well the way you wish well to someone who is simply a person you have known for a long time, with warmth but without weight. She stepped across the border stones. Rowan was waiting on the other side, as he had been that first morning in the meadow, at the edge of things, patient, asking nothing, simply present. They shifted together and they ran, not away from something, not toward something they were desperate to reach, but with the easy, joyful purposefulness of creatures who know where they are going and are not in any particular hurry to stop enjoying the going. The mountain air was cool and sweet with pine and summer-warmed stone. The forest moved around them with the particular attentiveness it had developed for Maren, aware of her, welcoming, oriented to her the way the moon is oriented to the earth, gravitational and ancient and true. They ran until the valley opened beneath them, and the cabin was visible below, with its silver-gray timber and its garden and the thread of Silver Creek beside it. And they stopped on the overlook, and she looked down at the life she had made for herself, the life she had made from the pieces of heartbreak, assembled in the mountain quiet with her own hands, and she felt something she wanted to name correctly. Not happiness exactly, though happiness was in it. Not pride, though she was allowed to be proud. Rightness. The feeling of a life that fit. The feeling of a woman in her own story, at last, in the story she had been meant to be living all along, not the supporting character in another person's journey, but the protagonist of her own. Beside her, Rowan nudged her shoulder gently with his own. She nudged Ack. They ran down into the valley together. There is a particular kind of story that the world does not tell often enough. It is not the story of a woman who blooms in the first days of her youth and then fades gracefully into the background of other people's stories. It is not the story of a woman who is rescued or who is completed by another person's love or who requires a man's recognition to understand her own worth. It is the story of a woman who is broken open by betrayal, by grief, by the specific cruelty of having given her best and had it called something less than it was, and who, in the breaking, discovers something that the unbroken version of herself might never have found. Herself. Her real self, the self that had been patiently waiting beneath all the years of service and loyalty and careful self-erasure, the wolf who was not a support beam in someone else's structure, but a foundation in her own right. This is not a story about aging as something to be overcome or hidden or apologized for. Maren's wisdom came from her years. Her strength was built from her decades of experience. The power the moon goddess revealed to her on that spring night was not despite her age, but because of it. Because 60 years of living, of loving, of losing and rebuilding, of showing up for others and finally learning to show up for herself had made her into exactly what she was, a woman in full possession of everything she had earned. This is a story for every woman who has ever wondered at 50 or 60 or 70 whether the most important parts of her life are behind her. They are not. The seed of a tree planted in midlife still grows. The garden tended in a woman's later years still blooms, and often more beautifully than the gardens of youth, with the richness of soil that has been worked, of a gardener who has learned patience, of roots that go down deep. This is a story for every woman who has been called loyal and dutiful and steady and reliable, all true things, all real things, but never quite called magnificent. You are magnificent. Your loyalty was never just duty. Your care was never just service. The life you have spent holding others together was never small, never wasted, even when it was not recognized as the gift it was. And if the recognition has not come from outside you, if the world has been slow to see what you are, then perhaps it is time. Time to walk to the edge of your own clearing. Time to sit in the quiet, in the good, unhurried quiet, and listen for the voice that has been trying to reach you through all the noise. You were never meant to stand behind. You were never meant to be the support beneath someone else's power. The power is yours. It always has been. Sometimes rejection is not an ending. Sometimes the door that closes is the moon goddess herself pointing you toward the one that was always meant to open, the one that leads not to someone else's story, but home, all the way home, to the life that was always, patiently, divinely yours.